Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Joining us for the second half of our show is Lee Goodman, member and former chair of the Federal Election Commission. Lee, welcome to the show.
Bill, thank you for having me.
Lee, as we come into the home stretch of one of the most divisive and certainly the most expensive presidential campaigns in American history, I thought it would be helpful to talk to one of the umpires that interpret and enforce the rules of the game. And before we dig into specific hot-button issues like Citizens United, remind us what the FEC is, when it was established, what its responsibilities are, and how you guys actually work.
Bill, the Federal Election Commission is a small agency in Washington, D.C. It's an agency with a budget of about $75 million a year, has about 350 employees, and that's very small by federal agency standards. It was created in 1974. In the wake of Watergate, as part of the post-Watergate reforms, to be the clearinghouse for all the campaign finance reports that are filed by candidates for the U.S. House, candidates for the United States Senate, and candidates for president, as well as the national and state parties' federal accounts that are established to participate in federal elections. We do not regulate state or local politics.
So how's a commission set up? Who's on it? Does the chair rotate? How does that all work?
You can imagine the debate in Congress to set up an agency to regulate their own political activity. You can imagine what the senators and the congressmen must have been thinking. And by the way, Watergate had revelations not just about the abuse of money in politics, but also about the misuse of government to persecute political enemies of Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon had used the Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service to attack his political enemies. So here was Congress trying to create an agency that would both regulate their political activity, but also not weaponize government to allow a White House power or one political party power over the other, to misuse that power or abuse it. So Congress very carefully constructed the FEC, unique among federal agencies, as an even-numbered body. There are 6 commissioners.
No tiebreaker.
The law specifically provides that there can be no more than 3 Republicans and no more than 3 Democrats. So historically, the commission has been constituted of 6 commissioners appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and there have historically been 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats on the commission. Currently, we have 3 identified Republicans, 2 identified Democrats, and 1 commissioner who steadfastly maintains that he is an independent. He tends to caucus with the 2 Democratic commissioners and to vote about 90% of the time with the 2 Democratic commissioners, but politically maintains his independence. The second prudential feature to the creation of the commission that Congress set in the new law was that it requires 4 votes to proceed with any regulatory action. So there must be some modicum of bipartisanship to regulate and restrict political activity, all of which is protected by the First Amendment, some of which is regulated and restricted in order to prevent corruption in politics.
I understand that this necessity for a bipartisan vote, at least 4 votes, has caused some to accuse the FEC of becoming dysfunctional.
Yes, the narrative of dysfunction is the narrative of those who want to regulate politics more. I don't think that by objective measures, this agency is statistically or objectively dysfunctional. At one point in 2015, I had to calculate all the votes taken by the commission on all matters, everything from administrative issues, from the mundane to all the substantive matters that we vote on. And I applied no methodology to get those statistics. In other words, I didn't pick and choose the subjects. And do you know that we reached 4 or more votes, meaning bipartisan votes, in 93% of all the votes cast in the agency? Now, when I broke that down to just the substantive matters we vote on, where the rubber really hits the road, That is enforcement cases, rulemakings, the issuance of advisory opinions, the approval of audits of political committees. We had majority votes in 86% of all substantive matters that we took. And by the way, sometimes those votes include 3-3 votes along the way to getting to a majority vote, and I counted all those as well, even though ultimately the commission arrived at a majority position. I think a lot of families would be doing well to have a majority agreement within the household in 93 or 86% of all cases, especially if you look at partisanship in Washington generally. I think those are very good statistics.
Can you imagine if Congress played so well together?
Yeah. Now, the narrative of dysfunction, however, is those who see the regulatory glass as half empty. And so rather than just say, we want to regulate more and we disagree with the Republicans substantively, they put a label on it called dysfunction. Now, I don't know that Americans want their politics decided by 3-2 votes with the White House controlling the 3. You know, if you look at the Federal Communications Commission or the Federal Trade Commission, those are agencies that are constituted with an odd number of commissioners, and the votes are 3-2, and the 3 always goes to the White House, which opens up shades of potential Nixonism. And so if I were to go over to the FCC today, you would see a number of 3-2 votes on very weighty substantive issues. Is that how we would want to regulate the baseball game between the Republicans and the Democrats and the democracy at large? By letting the White House place a call over to the chairman of an agency and politicize an agency? I don't think we want to do that. And so therefore, the narrative of dysfunction is really those who want to regulate more and are frustrated that the 3 Republican commissioners take a more libertarian viewpoint on the extent to which we regulate free speech in America.
Lee, when you look about weaponizing these agencies, it brings up the question of prosecutorial discretion, which is a major factor in enforcing the law. I mean, whether it's an agency or an attorney general or the IRS, as you mentioned. You know, as the number of rules and regulations we live under grow larger and larger, one of our regular guest, Harvey Silverglate, likes to point out that the average American arguably commits 3 felonies a day. Do you see a pattern in how the ruling party uses or abuses prosecutorial discretion to go after political opponents?
I don't know that I would necessarily characterize it as the ruling party, depending on who the ruling party is. I can say this. If you look at college campuses today as a microcosm, the intellectual left in America has decided that it is prudent and wise, and we can achieve a superior society by controlling free speech. And that means inviting certain speakers to campus and disinviting others, and carefully regulating where people can speak and when they can speak, all in the name of vaulted purposes of protecting people from uncomfortable ideas. Some want to make the democracy at large like a college campus, and they believe that government should be empowered to very carefully regulate speech in the name of a number of very high-sounding public policies like egalitarianism, like preventing subversion of American democracy and our Constitution, if you remember McCarthyism. The intellectual left today, yes, believes that the Securities and Exchange Commission ought to be requiring corporations to disclose every political expenditure broadly defined, not, however, to protect shareholders, although that's the nominal purpose, but to empower the critics of those corporations to drive down shareholder value. They lobbied, the intellectual left lobbied the IRS to go after the Tea Party groups and patriot groups in America for doing what? Organizing grassroots citizens. This wasn't about big money. And then state attorneys general have begun developing very creative theories of, for example, fraud to investigate global warming research at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and at a corporation called Exxon. all in the name of protecting people from potential fraud, when what we really know global warming to be is a public policy issue. And at the Federal Election Commission, there is legislation pending in Congress to turn us into a 3-2 body to give the White House effective 3-2 control over political speech in America. So everywhere we turn, intellectual lefts are trying to empower government to regulate free speech and association in the same way that the intellectual left has done on college campuses.
Lee, let's get on to the issue of money in politics and its connection to free speech. The Citizens United campaign expenditure case energized the left about as vigorously as a Kelo eminent domain case energized the right. Remind us what Citizens United was all about and what the impact has been of that Supreme Court ruling.
If I could give a little historical context, for decades, the law in the United States prohibited all corporations from making any expenditures to discuss elections. And that affected labor unions, which are incorporated, business corporations, as well as nonprofit corporations. They were all excluded from the public debate about elections. In 2010, in a case involving a filmmaker, it was an advocacy group called Citizens United that made a documentary film and wanted to disseminate its documentary film. The Supreme Court heard arguments about whether or not the government should or could constitutionally restrict all corporations from speaking about elections. And the Supreme Court ruled that just because a group of people or a business or a labor union incorporates, it does not shed its First Amendment rights. That has freed up a lot of additional speech in the democracy from the right and the left. You have business corporations, primarily through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, participating in elections. You have labor unions now freely spending and expressing their viewpoints in elections. And this has frustrated many on the left who are concerned either that the speech is somehow distortive of democracy, or, more cynically, they want to foreclose business corporations from speaking about free market economics and perhaps persuading somebody.
And how do they feel about unions using the dues of their members to advance political agendas?
Well, let me say this. Here are 3 statements that you will never hear the left criticize Citizens United about. You will never hear these statements from those who criticize Citizens United. You'll never hear them say that the AFL-CIO is a big corporation that is hurting democracy by spending too much money on politics. You will never hear them say that the Sierra Club is a dark money group that's harming our democracy and must disclose its donors. And you'll never hear them say that there's a billionaire named Jeff Bezos who owns a big corporation called the Washington Post, and it is unfairly drowning out my voice in the democracy because it owns too many printing presses. You won't hear those things. And so big institutions on the right and the left have been able to exercise these rights recognized by Citizens United. And, by the way, exercising rights recognized in Citizens United, the right and the left of the political spectrum have been competitive in how much they spend and in how much speech that they purchase with those dollars in the democracy in 2012 and in 2014, and I'm sure that they will be competitive in this election cycle as well.
Lee, the case that money can actually buy elections seems to be contradicted by the spectacular failure of Jeb Bush's spending to buy him the nomination or Hillary Clinton's spending to put away Donald Trump. Back in the days when we only had 3 TV networks and there was no internet, it was pretty easy to command the public's attention with TV advertising. To what extent is that still true in the age of social media?
Well, I think you raise a very interesting point there, Bill. I often call it the cacophony effect. And that is, you know, when you and I were growing up, we had the dog-eared antennas on our TV, and we got CBS, ABC, and NBC, and that's all we got. That's where Americans got their news. Today, we have probably 20 cable news channels. We have numerous talk and political radio shows to listen to. We still have print journalism to turn to. And we have the Internet. And the Internet is a free-for-all of political and social speech and commentary and association. People form associations for free now on a social platform called Facebook. People form associations and speak among each other through the Twitterverse. And because the online world is just a cacophony of voices, and people speak for either no cost or very low cost on the Internet, my position and the formal rule of the Federal Election Commission for the last 10 years has been that we, as an agency, do not regulate all of that free speech on the Internet because, by definition, it is low cost or no cost, and it is inherently non-corruptive. We do regulate one aspect of online advertising. If I buy a banner ad on the WashingtonPost.com website or on AOL.com, we regulate that expenditure for an advertisement placed on the Internet just like we would an ad placed in the paper edition of the Washington Post. But if I am posting information for free on YouTube or on my own website or even for free on another person's website, but I'm posting it for free and the dissemination cost is free, and I can now reach 1 million viewers or 2 million viewers to my YouTube video because it goes viral, but I didn't pay money to reach those 2 million viewers, we do not regulate that. And I think that's a good thing. Free speech has been prolific on the Internet. The little guys have broken big media monopolies on the Internet, gained large audiences on the Internet, and what goes viral is interesting speech that people choose to share among each other. And so I have fought very hard here at the Federal Election Commission to protect the rule that the Commission adopted in 2006 to keep that speech free. There has been an active effort within the Commission, principally by one commissioner, Commissioner Ann Ravel, to begin regulating speech and YouTube posts on the Internet. And I've just drawn a line, and I fought very hard to protect that freedom.
Lee, polls show that trust of journalists in the mainstream media has dropped to an all-time low, at least since polling started. Although I understand from my reading of history that trust in the press was also pretty low back when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson faced off for election. As people seek other sources of information in this internet cacophony, where it's so difficult to verify fact and truth and fiction and polemic, do you see partisanship increasing in America, or are we going to turn around at some point and start coming together on more issues?
Well, that's certainly been a concern by many social commentators, that the divergence and diversity of media have splintered Americans, whereas ABC, CBS, and NBC used to have a homogenization effect on us. Mm-hmm. We all consumed basically the same information and came to public opinion through those limited portals of information and the local newspaper. We now have literally thousands of opportunities and places to go for information. And some people self-select to conservative radio. Mm-hmm. Some people watch Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, and some people watch Sean Hannity on Fox News. And as people self-select, some concern has been expressed that people are becoming more polarized. My own position is this. In the cacophony age of speech and media and information, people have a right to self-select, and the antidote is more speech, not less. And so that's why we need to allow more speakers, more podiums on the debate stage, and why we can't give government the ability to begin regulating some, picking and choosing, and trying to control what people consume by way of information.
Speaking of more podiums on the debate stage, the FEC doesn't control who appears in debates, but do you think we'll start to see third-party candidates showing up at some point?
Well, it has been my regulatory position that it's not the government's role to tell the candidates, the major candidates or any other candidates, who has to debate, right? So the candidates choose whether they want to debate or not. For media-run debates, my position has been that whether it is Fox News or CNN, they have editorial freedom, press freedom to choose whom to interview in their studios and on their stages. They can choose to interview one candidate or two or 6 or 17. It is up to them. As for nonprofit sponsored debates, they are required by law to have objective criteria. The major presidential debate commission has objective criteria that they will sponsor debates and include any candidate who is polling at 15% or greater. Now, Ross Perot made that cutoff, and that's why Ross Perot debated in 1992 with Bill Clinton and former President George H.W. Bush.
Mm-hmm.
The Commission's judgment has been that a 15% cutoff is objective, it is reasonable, it does not implicate the debate commission in a form of corruption. That is, that the debate commission somehow is influencing the two major candidates. And you cannot make the two major candidates show up to a debate by government forcing the debate commission to reduce that threshold. So I've not supported government telling the debate commission or the major party candidates how they have to run that debate.
Lee, as you look ahead beyond this crazy presidential campaign, what's your biggest concern when it comes to election law?
Bill, I answer that question by looking to the past as prologue. Perhaps hindsight is 20/20, but let's all look back to an era of great fear and scare in America when the threat to the nation was communism. And people who wrote in Hollywood, the Hollywood 10, socialist economists like Paul Sweezy from New Hampshire, were being hailed in and targeted because of their liberal viewpoints and going to jail because they would not disclose the names of the people that they associated with.
Mm-hmm. Until
the Supreme Court stepped in and began to stand up to McCarthyism in 1957 in a decision called Sweezy v. New Hampshire. The government was running amok and scaring people and attacking people because of their political viewpoints. We can't go back to that era. Whether now it is the left attacking conservative right speech, but at that time it was conservatives attacking liberal speakers and associations. And so my greatest concern is that we lose our collective memory about what McCarthyism looked like, and that we not allow the laws of our land to be used to turn subpoenas into overriding policies that regularly invade people's associations and invades their free speech rights.
Lee, let's hope that despite the passions that are being thrown about in this current election, we can all come together as a nation and at least keep our ears open. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Bill, thank you for having me.
That was Lee Goodman, member and former chair of the Federal Election Commission, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at RealClearFuture.com for daily updates on the next big wave of technologies. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.